Hi, I'm Heather Hubbard. I went from being a lawyer and partner at one of the largest firms in America to becoming an online personality and successful entrepreneur. I know what it takes to rise to the top. I also know all too well the toll it can take on your health and personal life. So, how do you shine bright without burning out? How do you chase joy while achieving success? You're listening to the Hustle and Flow podcast. Welcome back to Hustle and Flow. I am your host, Heather Hubbard, and we are on episode 239. And I am finally recording my thoughts on the BigLaw breakdown. Trump going after BigLaw and their response, their capitulation, their silence, as well as the legal community and others, the business community, politicians, how they're really responding to what is happening. As you probably know, I was a partner and a practice group leader in BigLaw for many, many years, and I do have many thoughts. I have been recording episodes about diversity and equity and inclusion in BigLaw since the very beginning. When I first released or launched this podcast back in 2017, we released 5 episodes the very first day so that people could kind of binge. And episode number 4 was called Don't Blame It on the Kids. And that was about how BigLaw tried to always blame the fact that they didn't have more women in positions of power as partners on women having children. And that entire episode was how that was BS and how, if that were true, the men, the male lawyers of color, would have just as high of numbers as the white men. And they do not. Therefore, it cannot be about the kids. So I've been talking about this a long time. So for those of you who are not lawyers, and maybe you've been listening to the podcast since I broadened it and no longer made it just about law, you may be a little bit surprised that I'm talking about this, but given my background, you may not be. But for those of you who have been listening since the very beginning, you know that this is not something new. And I've actually had a few reach out and say, are you gonna talk about this? And I kept trying to decide, did I want to talk about it? And finally, I thought, yeah, let's do it, because I think it has much bigger implications than just the law. So let's dig in. All right, we're going to start with the current state of the world. I cannot imagine that you would not know about this, although maybe you wouldn't. I think as a lawyer, my circle of friends, they're talking about it a lot more. Those, especially on LinkedIn, it's everywhere. It's a really, really big deal. But, I trade stocks, and it is often talked about on CNBC, the fact that Trump is going after all of these law firms for alleged illegal DEI, which is absurd, and then getting them to do his pro bono that he cares about, as well as some other things, that it's just wild. It is absolutely wild, the fights that he's wanting to pick, because in the past, no one would really do that, and what he is asking for them. And then so many people are just outright shocked that most of these law firms are either staying silent, just hoping, fingers crossed, that he won't come after them, or they're straight up negotiating and settling without actually going to court. When we think of lawyers, especially the, allegedly the biggest, the brightest attorneys who are, in BigLaw, why would they not fight, especially something related to the rule of law? And frankly, I'm shocked that they're shocked. I'm like, are we really shocked? And so I thought, I'm not here to pound my chest and say, here's what we should be doing. I am a realist. I think I've always been a realist. And so I am here to share my direct feedback and opinions. It's not going to be sugar coated, but I'm also going to share why I'm not surprised, why I don't think we can really put that much pressure on Big Law, who can and who can't, as well as what we can actually do, whether we are lawyers or not, what we can actually do to make a difference if we care. And I think most of us do care about what the administration is doing with law firms, with the courts, and just the rule of law in general. Let's start with the history of Big Law because I think that matters. And I think we forget it. So when I thought I'm going to do this episode, I went back and found my trusty note cards from 2017, 8 years ago. Anytime I speak, I keep my notes, and I don't do custom speaking engagements anymore where I'm literally presenting it for one and one time only. But I did back then. And this was for the New Hampshire Women Lawyers Association. They were celebrating 100 years in 2017. That was the first admitted female lawyer in New Hampshire. It was a fabulous group. They came from all over the state. There were men there were women there, judges. It was spectacular, spectacular group. And they had hired me to come in and do their keynote. And so I prepared something specifically for them. And they were honoring how far New Hampshire had come, and they were celebrating the future. And so you all know me. I definitely wanted to celebrate and focus on the future of what's possible and where we can go. But I thought it was really important that we first look at the history of how we got to be there in the first place, because I think that actually gives us a lot of information about where to focus our time, energy, and efforts, and not to take for granted where we are and what is happening. So shout out to New Hampshire for asking me to do that presentation, and which is why I even have these note cards. All right. So the history of Big Law. Now, even for New Hampshire, and every state's a little bit different, but their first admitted woman to practice was in 1917, which sounds amazing. It sounds impressive. It's like we've had 100 years of women in law, but not really. Not really. Because in 1890, there were actually 120 women lawyers throughout the United States. 120. But let's be clear, they were teachers, writers, assistants, and housewives. They were not actually practicing law. And for those who were practicing law, they were doing it with their brothers, their uncles, their fathers, and their husbands. It was definitely not Big Law. It would be in small towns. It would be where there were men sponsoring them, and they really weren't being held out as a lawyer. So yes, they got a law degree and or passed the bar of that state. It was a little bit different in each state, but they weren't really practicing law like the men. Okay, so then let's move forward to the 1920s, because as we know, there was not a right for women to vote until then, not nationwide. Okay, so at this point, when women got the right to vote, you started to see more women going to law school. Now, obviously, these were women of wealth. These were women from prominent families. To be able to go to law school in and of itself was a very privileged thing and not something available to anyone. That said, the women who did go to law school, you can only imagine what they faced when they were in those rooms with all of those men. Also, when they graduated from law school, no one would hire them as a lawyer. They often would end up becoming stenographers or librarians. Yes, stenographers or librarians. They might help out in the courtroom. They might help out at a law firm, but not as a lawyer unless they were married to a lawyer or they had relatives who were lawyers that allowed them to work in their offices. Again, that was not big law. That would be your small town practices where the men let them do that and a community that would support them. That was few and far between. All right, in the 1930s, we had the New Deal. Lots of new laws. And so a lot of lawyers were needed. And when that happened, there were more lawyers, women lawyers, who were hired for the government. Not really in law firms, definitely not in big law firms. Even the few that were in big law, and there were a few, they were limited to trust and estate work. That was the law they were allowed to practice. They couldn't just practice any law. There was definitely not a summer internship, a summer program where they would go in and get to choose or interview for those positions. They were never, ever, ever promoted. The concept that they would become a partner was absurd. In many ways, they were like a paralegal, but they were considered lawyers so that they could charge those higher rates. So let's move to the 1940s. As you might expect, this was what happened throughout America in factories and other professions. You had a lot of men go off to war and women were needed. So during World War II, women were hired in big law and other law firms at a really, really high rate. But as soon as the war was over, as soon as the men came home, they were let go. They were no longer needed. They simply were filling a gap. They were doing their patriotic duty, according to the men, and then it was time for them to go home. So during the time of the 40s, law school increased from 3% to 12% of women. But it immediately dropped back to pre-war levels as soon as the men came back. So again, it really was World War II that allowed women to really start going to law school more, to really start showing up and having real legal jobs. But then they went away. Of those who were allowed to stay or were hired and continued on, they had lower starting salaries. They had segregated offices and lunchrooms. Big law. Segregated lunchrooms, segregated offices. They were not on the same floor. They did not hang out together. They were limited to the practice areas that they were allowed to be in. Again, it was mostly trusts and estates. And they had to do their own secretarial work because men couldn't do that. They didn't know how to do that. But obviously, women, like that really, that's their thing. Of course, they could do that. So, when we think back to the 40s and we say, oh, women were lawyers, poor women, like most of us just can't even imagine. And let's be clear, when we are talking in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s about these poor women, they definitely were not poor and they were absolutely white women. So that is what we are talking about as we are talking about women in law. These women were not women of color. These were not poor women. These were very privileged white women. Okay, so let's go to the 1950s. There was basically no progress. Nothing happened in that decade. Although two interesting things did happen in that decade, and that was that Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg graduated from law school. Sandra Day O'Connor graduated in 1952, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg graduated in 1959. Now, I believe, I don't have this written down. This is probably blasphemy that I don't know it. I believe that Sandra Day O'Connor was either number one or number two at Stanford. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she was number one at Columbia. So Sandra Day O'Connor, she was only offered positions as a legal secretary. That was what they were like, oh, fabulous. You did great in law school. We don't have really room for a woman. But if you'd like to come on, you can be a secretary. She ended up doing government work and moving up the chain that way. That was how she eventually became a Supreme Court justice. But when she graduated, top of her class, they offered her a legal secretary position. 1959, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, first in her class at Columbia, was rejected by every single law firm in New York that she wanted to work with. Again, so, she ended up doing government nonprofit work because that was what was available. Big Law was not interested in either of these future Supreme Court justices. So, okay, 1960s. Again, very, very little progress, not much is happening. Law firms, big law firms, they would hold their meetings at all male clubs. So there were business clubs, and they were clearly like women were not allowed in these business clubs. So anytime they would hold any kind of attorney meeting, we're not just talking about partners meetings, attorney meetings, they were held at these clubs. And because women weren't allowed, clearly the female attorneys were not invited. And why would they be invited to do business anyway? They don't know anything about business. They refused to hire women and they refused to interview women. Again, this kind of goes back to Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There's actually a lot of really interesting articles and about this. Like if you do some Google searches, go back and read the articles and the research on this. You can read the quotes from some of those big law partners about what it was like, what was being said, and how they felt about women in law. And it is as wild and shocking and offensive as you would expect. Of the women who were in big law, none were promoted to partner. They were excluded from any kind of client contact. Again, they were treated more like a paralegal, although even paralegals often will have client contact. But it was like, we're going to keep you in the back room. We talk about they were never allowed to be at social events or even serve on committees, which, as we know now, is what we love to have women do in big law. Just give them the committee work and the social event work. But back then, it was very prestigious and important for men to be running those committees and holding those events, so that they could do what, like, the locker room stuff, what the boys wanted to do. The women were not invited. Okay, so what changed? What finally changed? Did Big Law wake up one day and say, you know what? We've really been looking at this wrong the whole time. These women are really valuable. They're so smart, and we should include them. Do you think that that's what happened? No, of course not. All right, so let's look at the 1970s. So we know like late 60s, early 70s, that was a lot of the women's lib movement. And that not only impacted all of society, but started to impact law as well. So there were some really bold, brave women who came forward and started complaining. And this happened, of course, in your bigger cities, those crazy woke cities, those crazy woke universities that, I'm guessing Trump and his cronies and a lot of white men still have a lot of hatred towards because they're the ones who started this mess in the first place, telling them that they had to accept women and people of color. So in 1971, New York University and Columbia prepared a study and filed a complaint with the New York Commission on Human Rights. It was interesting, again, because the women couldn't get a lot of jobs. They were forced into government. And so they were the ones leading a lot of this stuff. And so, just a fun fact here, a 1964 Yale graduate who was a woman but couldn't get a job, she was actually leading the investigation for the human rights. And she confirmed, yes, there is a pattern and practice of discrimination. I mean, obviously, this is how it started. This is how it started, the 1970s in New York. All right. So then case went to federal district court, a case against Sullivan Cromwell, and it was assigned to Baker Motley. Another fun fact, because Baker was a 1946 Columbia Black female graduate who happened to be a federal district court judge, which I think is really amazing. Because let me tell you what, I don't think that there were any women in 1946 that were Black women graduating from law schools in the South and were not judges. I could be wrong. You all can correct me, but I doubt it. Okay, so Sullivan Cromwell, they sought to have her recused. They were like, she could not be partial. She is a woman. She is a Black woman. The only person who could determine this is a white man. I mean, I don't know how he wouldn't be prejudiced either. Like, if we're saying that, you know what I mean? Like, that it's just going to come down to gender and race, then everyone's prejudiced. It was then transformed into a class action lawsuit. Okay, everybody sit down, hold on, because we're getting ready. I'm getting ready to share some really wild, exciting news. Big law, big law, big law, big law. They settled in 1977. They settled. Okay. So the government came after them for practices of discrimination. And instead of fighting it, they settled. The same thing that they are doing today. Big law gonna be big law. They settled. They did not fight it. And let's be clear, they did not agree with it. They were not happy with it. The fact that they did not want to interview women, the fact that they did not want to hire women, like that was their belief. That was their value. But they did not fight. They settled. So we're going to come back to this. It matters. And it was with that that they agreed to the guidelines regarding hiring women. And as soon as that happened, as soon as that first settlement happened, then there were similar lawsuits all across the country against law firms as well as law schools, and they all settled. They all settled. And there were all these guidelines that they then had to comply with. And guess what? That is how women got to be in big law. It was not because big law changed their mind. It was because they were forced. Their hand was forced and they capitulated. All right. So that is when we then started to see progress. It's really just been in the last 50 years, again, because they were forced. So the result of the 1970s litigation was we went from 4% women in 70 to 12.4% women in 1980. And that was nationwide. So huge, huge change in how many women were practicing law at that point. It was also the 1980s that we started to see the employment laws change. That's when we started to see maternity leave, part-time positions. You can look at Milbank, Sherman Sterling, Cahill Gordon, Sullivan Cromwell. These were like the big law firms back in the day. If you look at when they started taking women on as associates or in junior positions where they were segregated and never allowed to really be promoted and could only practice in certain areas, that started happening in the 30s and the 40s. Okay? But you did not see the first female partners in those law firms until the early, let's see, we've got 77, 79, 81, and 82. So there was, a 40, 50-year gap between having women and actually promoting women, but very few were promoted. So that is the history of big law and having women in big law. And again, we're still really talking about white women, so I just want to make that clear. But that really is where it started. Okay, so now, now let's move to big law today and the progress that big law has made or not made, as well as DEI in big law. You can go back and listen to, okay, I think it was we're going far back, y'all. You got to go back to these early episodes. I think we have episode 9 was The Numbers Don't Lie, and episode 34 was the Meeting the Challenge update. So that was in 2017, the National Association of Women Lawyers. And there has been progress. There are updated numbers. I am not pulling those. Go check, go look at what NAWL is doing. You can find all of that. But the moral of the story, the punchline is very little progress has been made. Let's see, I think it was 1991. I think that was the year that women started, it was 50% women in law school. And so you would think that you would start to see more women associates and partners, and the partner numbers have barely budged, especially equity partner, because that was one of the things they did, right? When it started to become a problem, they were like, well, let's have non equity and equity. And so we'll say we have women partners, but the women are non equity and the men are equity. So if you want to look at women equity partners, the numbers have changed, but they have barely budged. And I think it's still projected. It's like over 100 years from now, when women would actually have just even like 30% representation in big law. So we've got women bar associations, we've got initiatives, we've got DEI programs, we've got all of these things, and yet the numbers are not budging. And again, I'm mostly talking about women here, and this is mostly white women. These numbers are atrocious. They are far worse for women of color. And this is also true of men of color. This is true for people of color in general, but those who are actually impacted the most, and again, the numbers do not lie, is Black people, and especially Black women, because they are Black and they are a woman. So they've got it all coming together, and their numbers are the absolute worst. To think that there are all of these illegal, I keep putting illegal in quotes if you're watching me on YouTube, practices in big law, it's just comical, because women know, people of color know, Black women know, there is there is no equality in big law. For the most part, it is PR, it's public relations, it's publicity. I served on a diversity committee. I know so many others who have served on diversity committees. I work with so many people who are the chief diversity officer at all of these big law firms. And it is such a difficult job. It is so frustrating, because they will say they care, they will create these committees, but at the end of the day, they generally are not willing to do what is actually required to even create true diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So to think that they are, that big law is woke and they're just promoting all of these, people who are not qualified, like we've got to go back to a merit system. It's like, okay, so what you're saying is you want to go from 90% white men to 100% white men? Like what are we actually talking about? For those who like maybe don't understand big law, the fact that they're even saying that they are somehow doing things amazing is hilarious. It's just not true. And obviously, some law firms do better than others. But when you think about big law and you think about the number of attorneys who practice at any one of these given firms, you have to keep in mind that that they are kind of a living, breathing organism, and that there's politics involved. It matters who's the leader. Every office looks a little bit different. The concept that they represent one idea or one ideal or certain values, I mean, for the most part, that is just a branding exercise. It is just a public relations exercise. And so much of that is what diversity is. It's to appease and make happy clients who say that that matters to them. And so when they're meeting numbers that, Trump is saying is illegal, that really is coming from pressure from the clients. It's not really coming from within. And so, yeah, these DEI initiatives are there, but they're often banging their heads against the wall. So It's just kind of a joke that Trump is going after the law firms. Okay, but so why is Trump going after the law firms? Well, if he is wanting to go after the rule of law, and if he is wanting a lot of free legal work, which of course is part of all of his settlement negotiations, then he's going to go after BigLaw. He's also putting pressure on them to not do pro bono work for people and organizations and issues that he does not like, which clearly is a problem. The president should never be telling law firms what to do or not to do. And I mean, this goes with the federal freezes and everything else, which is a bit of a different episode. But if our administration coming in every 4 years or every 8 years is going to completely upset the apple cart and everyone has to do whatever that particular person wants, there's absolutely no stability. That is, we can, that is not, that creates no longevity or stability for a democracy. That is a nightmare. Again, different episode. We all listening to this are probably on the same page with that. So why are we shocked and surprised that BigLaw is settling? I'm actually surprised and shocked that some are not, right? So let's talk about what actually matters to BigLaw. What matters to BigLaw is money. I mean, obviously. Again, I don't know why people are shocked by this. Like that has always been the case. And let's be honest, those of us who practiced in BigLaw, why did we go? Why did we practice there? Why are you practicing there now? Power, prestige, and money. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it's what we talk about with the golden handcuffs. Like we want to make a lot of money, and we think that that is the path in which we can make a lot of money. If you look at even like AmLaw 200, if you look at the way that law firms, what mattered in terms of being able to get laterals or to get placed, it's profits per partner. That was not always the case. That has become the new thing over the last 20 years, maybe 25, profits per partner. And so it has become this is also part of why we now have non-equity and equity tracks, because the profits per partner, it's based on equity. That's what matters. That's what matters. And let me tell you, the lifestyles that they live, the private schools that they have to send their children to, they they can't just walk away. I mean, they could, but they're not going to just walk away. So money matters. All right, a few things here. How do they get their money? Well, they get their money from corporate clients. So they're going to do what they think their corporate clients want them to do. The reason why they have diversity initiatives is because their corporate clients say this is important to them. Therefore, they're like, okay, how do I check this box? Now, look, I still work with a lot of people in BigLaw, and I'm not saying that people within BigLaw do not care. There are a ton of people within BigLaw who absolutely care, but BigLaw as a whole, like as a system, as an organization, no, of course not. And I would be happy to talk with anyone who says otherwise. Like that is just, if they did, our numbers would look very different than they do. They care about the pressure from the clients. They don't want to lose their business. They don't want to lose their business. So the reason why you have a lot of these diversity initiatives, I mean, well, first off, we have women and people of color in BigLaw because the federal government, state governments went after them and they reached settlement agreements and they were like, okay, fine. And then they started to have DEI practices and initiatives because the corporate clients who are paying them and hiring them said, this matters to us. But they were very, very smart in figuring out what actually mattered and didn't matter. So within the corporations, they would say, like, you have to have this many people staffed. Some companies would say, like, you had to have this many equity partners, but it was generally pretty loosey goosey. So you would just find a token person to send to the pitch. You would find token people to put as part of the project, but the person getting the credit is still the same white men. So it's like we can do the, dog and pony show in order to meet your requirements and us still keep our money. Okay. So, as soon as Trump came out with his executive orders with DEI, or even before that, when it was obvious he was going to become president, what did we see happen? We saw all these CEOs go down to Mar-a-Lago and sit with Trump and shake his hand and say, "What can we do to help you?" We saw them all contribute to his inauguration fund because guess what companies also care about? Money. I mean, y'all, we live in it's capitalism. Like that, it is what it is. And I mean, I don't like that's not real shocking. So we have a lot of these companies who had values, but why did they have the values? I think they thought it would help them make money. But as soon as it's going to hurt their money, it's going to hurt their federal contracts, they're like, oh, well, it's not that important and we can change things to make you happy. People will have different arguments about they don't have a choice. But of course, right? Like this is the thing. Like it's so funny. Like above the law, they've got the what do they call it? I don't even remember. It's like basically the spine. Who in Big Law has a spine? The spineometer. Basically, no one. There's a few. There's a few. If the large companies capitulated first, why on earth do you think that Big Law would then push back? They're simply following the lead of the people who pay them money. Follow the money. All right. This is not surprising. Also, when we think of Big Law, let's know they are mostly corporate attorneys. They're not litigators. Every big law firm has a litigation department. They have litigators, but that is not everything they do. They are deal makers. They are risk averse. Let's go back to what happened in the 70s when they genuinely had a moral ground. They were principled about the fact that they didn't want any goddamn women in their law firms. Did they fight back? No. No, they rolled over. That's what they're going to do. That's what they're going to do. This is also why all the big law firms have in their partnership agreements that everything has to be arbitrated. They don't want to fight things. They want to settle things, and they don't want there to be anything in the news about it. Like they want the confidentiality that comes from arbitration. This is what Big Law does. There is nothing new about this. Again, if if we think that Big Law represents the rule of law, well, I just don't know where we've been the last 100 years. That's not. So, okay. So if what matters is what clients think and money and being risk averse and just settling, making things go away. Also, they don't want to spend a bunch of money to save money. They're like, we'll just settle. We don't actually care. We never wanted women here anyway. I get some of y'all who are at Big Law listening to this are like, oh my gosh, is she saying that? Okay, I get that a lot of people have changed, but also, given where we are, a lot of people have not. People still have grudges. And look, this goes back to slavery, women's right to vote, and everything else. It is different when you choose something versus being forced to do something. Your bitterness, your resentment, your anger, you hand it down to future generations. And also, let's not forget, we were just talking about the 70s and 80s. There's a lot of people alive today who were in the 70s and the 80s. I mean, I was born in the 70s, right? So we're talking about our mothers, our fathers, our grandmothers, our grandfathers. This is not that long ago. So to think that they all were forced to do something and then just changed their minds out of the goodness of their hearts is really naive. And look, I've done and thought a lot of naive things in my life, so I'm not judging. I'm just trying to call it like I see it so that we can let go of all of this anger towards Big Law because, I mean, Big Law just being Big Law. That anger should have always been there if that's how you feel. So, okay, what do we do? Because I do want to talk about blame, shame, and personal accountability. I'm seeing a lot of people say, like, how can you stay at a law firm that has capitulated? Okay. That would also be like saying, why are you staying in the United States, you know, when your neighbors voted for Trump? There are so many people that make up any one given big law firm. And to act like everyone in big law represents this, like the system itself absolutely does, but the individual attorneys, not so much. And we need individual attorneys to be in these large systems, to be in big law, to be in corporations as high up as they can so that there can be someone in the room that actually has a voice of reason. This is why you actually see some law firms fighting back, which is amazing. Like, that's the incredible part to me. Like, that means there actually has been progress made. To see some people walking away, that's amazing progress. But we shouldn't blame or shame the people who are practicing in big law because they can still fight on their own front and in their own way. Now, if they fully support it, if they are making excuses for it, that, then yeah, blame and shame all day long. But there are a lot of people in big law who don't agree with it and who are being a voice of reason, and they are still trying to push back. Like they are exhausted. Like totally exhausted, because not only are they doing everything that's required in big law, which is a ton of work, they're also still having to fight the systems within. So let's not blame and shame them for being in the system and staying in the system. We actually need them there. So let's talk about what we can do, because that's the most important piece, right? Like, it's not about pointing fingers at what others should be doing. Like, let's look and see what we can be doing. Okay, first and foremost, let's look at how laws got changed over the years in the first place. It was from nonprofits, it was from legal aid organizations, it was from bar associations, other organizations, amicus briefs. This is how law got changed in the first place. It wasn't because of big law or anybody else. So, what are you doing to support those organizations? Are you financially supporting those organizations? Are you donating money to those organizations? Maybe it is donating your own time. Oftentimes, they don't need time, they just need money. But there are ways to do that. Support the lawyers who have always been the ones on the front lines doing the difficult work to actually make change and to uphold the rule of law. Support them. They need it. They always have. Also, speak up. Whether you are in those big law firms or you are not, especially if you are a lawyer, speaking up about the rule of law is very, very important. Speaking up about what law actually looks like in terms of the numbers, so that it's not just this, random woke theory. No, like, let's look at the numbers. There's nothing woke about it. There's women and people of color are still very much oppressed and have not been making that much progress within big law. So let's actually still stay focused on what is happening within big law, and not saying that, like, Trump is somehow like now putting pressure on them to act in bad ways. I mean, they were already acting in bad ways. So speak up about it. Like, we need to be, and I was speaking up about this even when I was in big law. And there are a ton of people in big law who speak up. So be vocal. Share what you think is needed, what you think is wrong, and what the future should be. Speak up, speak up, speak up. Big law is risk averse. They're not actually going to tell you to shut up. Okay. This is like, I always tell this to associates too, right? Like, know what they actually care about and don't care about. Speak up. They're not going to do anything about it. Okay. Support diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm not talking about supporting initiatives. I'm talking about actually supporting it. Are you sponsoring and actually helping others? Are you pushing back? When you think of how many, like, if you're in big law, if you're thinking of how many Black women are in your firm, okay, well, what are you personally doing? And I'm not talking about just being nice. I mean, are you actively sponsoring? Are you actively making sure that people are being supported? Are you actively going to your chief diversity officer or those who are making a difference and saying, how can I support you? Is there something specific I can do? But on top of that, don't wait for someone to tell you what to do, and you don't just have to ask. Like, just take action. Take personal responsibility. And I have a great opportunity for you. So, Dr. Lynn Maureen Hurdle, she is a conflict resolution specialist. She started On the Matter of Race in, might have been 2020. You've heard from her before if you have been around here at all. I did her On the Matter of Race course. So this is for white people. Okay. This is for white people. She and her son, they teach a very small cohort program called On the Matter of Race. And if you're like, I'm already an ally, I read books, like I'm supportive, I'm doing the things, I would encourage you to check out this program because it is going to take you on a much, much deeper level. And there are exercises that you will engage in that will really help you see just how much of an ally you are or you are not. And you are going to learn a lot of things that you never knew before. You might be pushed in ways you've never been pushed before. I have never been in a program where there was so much honesty from the white people in the room as well as the Black facilitators in the room. And it truly is a gift. And if you are blaming and shaming and talking about BigLaw and you are a white person and you are not actively sponsoring, supporting, financially donating to, and doing your own work, you just got to stop because you're still part of the problem, right? And if we want to make a difference, we start with ourselves. Do the systems need to change? Yes, of course. But it's going to take those of us individually taking responsibility and being in those systems and challenging those systems. Now, she can only take 12 people, although she actually has some companies where she comes in and does them for companies. So if you are one of those amazing companies or BigLaw groups that you are allowed to do things, and you don't even have to do it through the company itself, right? Like if they don't want to pay for it, get together. Put your money where your mouth is. This goes with donations and investing in programs. Don't worry about if your law firm's paying for it. Gather together white allies in your group and go say, we'd like to put this group together. Will you lead it? And it's even more powerful when you do it within your company or your law firm because you can work on issues in the firm and company. Very, very powerful. But go check out her work. Her next group starts in mid-May. She interviews. She doesn't just take anybody, but go check it out. It is theconflictcloser.com/OTMR. OTMR. I will put the link in the show notes. That is something that you can go do today, is invest in your own anti-racism work, because Trump may tell other people they can't do it, but he can't stop you, okay? Go do your work and go be an ally. Go use your voice and focus on what matters, because the rule of law very much matters, and diversity, equity, and inclusion matters more now than ever. And we have to show up for those who have always been oppressed and are now being even more oppressed. Okay, so that is my BigLaw breakdown, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, give the episode a like and leave a comment below so we can keep the conversation going. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a future episode or announcement. Listening on Apple, Spotify, or another podcast app, you can watch the video and join in the after show conversation by visiting hustleandflowpodcast.com.